Thank you. That was a very generous introduction, and thank you for inviting me. It's really a pleasure and an honor. And thank you to the audience for joining with us. Jordanian ruler Abdullah I gloated in 1924 when Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the visionary who carved modern Turkey out of the ruins of the Ottoman Empire, abolished the caliphate. Abdullah was at the time congratulatory telegram. He went on to say in an interview, the Prophet was an Arab. The Quran is in Arabic. The holy places are in Arabia, and the Caliph should be an Arab of the tribe of Quraysh, the tribe of the Prophet. The Caliphate had returned to Arabia in Abdullah's mind. Fact of the matter is that it didn't. A century later, it is not the Caliphate that Muslim powerhouses are fighting about. It is religious soft power to garner geopolitical influence, power, and dominance. It is what I would describe as a battle for the soul of Islam that pits rival Middle Eastern and Asian powers against one another. Turkey, seat of the Islamic world's last true caliphate. Saudi Arabia, home to the faith's holy cities. The United Arab Emirates, propagator of a militantly statist interpretation of Islam. Qatar with its less strict version of Wahhabism and penchant for political Islam. Indonesia, promoting a humanitarian, pluralistic notion of Islam that reaches out to other faiths as well as non-Muslim center-right forces across the globe. Morocco, which uses religion as a way to position itself as the face of moderate Islam. And of course, Iran with its derailed revolution. In the ultimate analysis, no clear winner may emerge. Yet the course of the battle could determine the degree to which Islam will be defined by either one or more competing stripes of ultra-conservatism, statist forms of the faith that preach absolute obedience to the ruler, and or reduce religious establishments to pawns of the state, or a truly more tolerant and pluralistic interpretation of one of the three Abrahamic religions. Implicit in the rivalry is a broader debate across the Muslim world that goes to the heart of the relationship between the state and religion, and what role the state, if at all, should play in enforcement of religious morals and the place of religion in education, judicial systems, and politics. Increasingly, lines dividing the state and religion become ever more blurred the more autocratic a political system is. One thing is for sure, if one looks at Muslim religious soft power efforts over the past 70 years, it has become more complex with the staggered entry of new players. The Saudis, with Pakistani and a degree of West African input, had no competitors in the 1960s as they created the building blocks of what would emerge as the world's single most focused public diplomacy campaign, far exceeding anything that the Soviets undertook, and in contrast to the United States, that could rely on its private sector cultural attributes, was by necessity a top-down, largely government-funded initiative. I don't want to dwell in great detail on the Saudi effort, but to say that depending on what part of the world and what country one looks at, Saudi funding was not necessarily subversive, that is to say, covert. It often was with the full knowledge, if not in cooperation of a government, and it was legal. The bulk of religious funding emanating in the kingdom at the time went to non-violent, often non-political groups and communities. It is only in a limited number of countries that Saudi money at given moments in history deliberately funded violence. Those countries include Afghanistan, Pakistan, Bosnia, Palestine, Syria, and Iraq. What constitutes Saudi funding is nebulous, and when defined, frequently driven by assumption rather than fact. In other words, I often have no idea who the donors are on receipts and documents related to Saudi funding in my possession, even if in many cases I know their names. In fact, I don't know for sure whether names that I have are real or not. I also don't know which donations were done on a purely individual and personal basis, and which were done with some form of tacit or explicit approval of the Saudi government. No one has a grip on Saudi donations and funding for which there is no record. Add to this that monies originating in Saudi Arabia flowed, and at times still flow, through multiple channels. Official government channels controlled by the Foreign and Religious Affairs Ministries, government-controlled non-governmental organizations, multiple Saudi-based religious and ethnic communities, as well as individuals. I would argue, however, that even if the various groups, including the government and the kingdom's religious establishment, may have had different motives and objectives regarding funding, religious figures and institutions were willing to make the necessary concessions to accommodate the government's purpose. That purpose was more the propagation of Wahhabism prior to the Iranian Revolution, and more designed to satisfy the proselytizing instincts of King Faisal and the religious establishment at the time. That changed with the 1979 Iranian Revolution. It became less about Wahhabism and more about furthering any ultra-conservative strand of Islam that served the government's purpose, which from 1979 onwards was countering Iranian revolutionary zeal and Shiism that was in its mind associated with the Iranian drive. To be sure, the level of funding and the thrust of Saudi religious soft power diplomacy has changed with the rise of Mohammed bin Salman. The drive today is to project the kingdom and its Islam as tolerant, forward-looking, outward rather than inward-looking, and open doors for the kingdom through demonstrative acts like the visit to Auschwitz by Muslim World League chief Mohammed al-Issa, and meetings between Mohammed bin Salman and rabbis and evangelist preachers. However, facts on the ground have not always changed. Certainly, textbooks have changed in a slow and grinding process, and significant social change has been introduced. But interfaith and religious tolerance has not led to changes such as allowing public worship in the kingdom by other faiths and the building of houses of worship. Access to holy sites like Mecca and Medina remains banned to non-Muslims. Often entry into mosques is barred. Similarly, the vagaries of the source and of what funding remains is often unclear and at times channeled in ways that is hard to track. The Islamic Revolution in Iran marked the moment that Saudi funding no longer was in a class of its own. It marked the beginning of what has emerged as a rivalry, one that went progressively beyond the Saudi-Iranian divide. The focus of the Iranian religious soft power effort, including the drive behind support for Shiite opposition groups in the Middle East and particularly the Gulf, changed within the first 2 years of the revolution. To be sure, the initial phase aimed at export of the revolution. The watershed shift of focus away from export of the revolution to a geopolitically focused religious soft and hard power struggle was the Iran-Iraq war and Gulf funding for Saddam Hussein's war effort. It is also what has shaped Iran and its religious strategy, including support for and recruitment of Shiite groups and communities in the Middle East, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, and the encouragement of groups that in a mirror image of Saudi activity sought to take the fight to Muslim communities in the Arab heartland. Elsewhere, like in Southeast Asia and West Africa, the thrust of Iranian religious support was like much of the Saudi effort, primarily focused on religious and social issues. To be sure, much of the perception of Iran is self-inflicted, starting with the occupation of the US Embassy in Tehran in 1979 and 1980. Yet the shift in focus was noticeable, even then, in debates about the utility of the embassy occupation that began to be questioned by men like Hojatollah Islam Hashemi Rafsanjani, the Speaker of the Parliament who later became president, Ayatollah Beheshti, and hanging judge Ayatollah Khalkhali. They made their doubts known in speeches in Parliament, as well as in interviews and conversations. What was an ideological rivalry became a geopolitical fight driven by an Iranian perception that the United States and the Gulf states sought the toppling of the Islamic regime. a perception that frames Iranians' thinking and policy until today. Finally, I would note that the relationship between various Shiite communities in Iran is as complex as the relationship of multiple Sunni communities is with Saudi Arabia. If the first phase of the rivalry was the uncontested Saudi religious soft power effort, and the second phase was the emergence of Iran and the rivalry/political battle between the kingdom and the Islamic Republic, the third phase and most recent phase is the most complex one, not only because of the emergence of new players, but also because it entails rivalries within rivalries. The new players are first and foremost the United Arab Emirates and Indonesia. It is also the phase in which the role of Turkey takes on added and perhaps more important dimensions. Qatar, like Turkey, crystallizes beyond doubt as the enemy in Emirati and Saudi eyes, and in which the UAE and the kingdom simultaneously cooperate and compete. And finally, the contradictions in the positions of some of the players are put on public display. And it is the phase in which perceptions of Islamist groups, such as the Muslim Brotherhood, flip from one-time useful tools in the confrontation with communism, the left more broadly, and Arab nationalism, to being one core of the problem. The 2011 revolts that toppled leaders in Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, and Yemen, and led to elections that were widely seen as free and fair, saw the rise of Islamist political parties, fueling the worst fears of men like UAE Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed, who was viscerally opposed to any expression of political Islam. Bin Zayed privately takes a dim view of ultra-conservative interpretations of the faith, like Wahhabism. Speaking to US Ambassador James Jeffrey in 2005, bin Zayed compared Saudi Arabia's religious leaders to somebody like the one who we are chasing in the mountains, a reference to Osama bin Laden, who at the time was believed to be hiding in a mountainous region of Afghanistan. In an email to New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman 12 years later, Yusuf al-Otaiba, a confidant of bin Zayed and the UAE's ambassador in Washington, asserted that Abu Dhabi fought 200 years of wars with Saudi over Wahhabism. Al-Otaiba's comment came a year after the UAE and Saudi Arabia sponsored a gathering of prominent Sunni Muslim leaders in the Chechen capital of Grozny that effectively and surprisingly excommunicated Wahhabism. Western leaders refrained from publicly commenting, but privately commended the efforts to confront a worldview that they feared provided a breeding ground, potentially, for extremism. Bin Zayed has played a key role in shaping bin Salman's policies to shave off Wahhabism's rougher edges and bring the UAE and Saudi Arabia's religious soft power endeavors closer together, centered on what author Shadi Hamid calls non-political politicized Islam, or a third trend in political Islam, that in the words of scholar Gregory Gauss, is tightly tied to state authority and subservient to it. Bin Zayed's efforts have paid off. Despite ruling with an iron fist, both bin Zayed and bin Salman project themselves as promoters of an Islam that is tolerant and apolitical and engages in interfaith dialogue. Both men have invested heavily in highly paid lobbyists to ensure that they are heard in the corridors of power in Western capitals. Both have embedded their religious soft power efforts in their geopolitical strategy that seeks to expand their regional sphere of influence. Bin Zayed, much like Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, has gone furthest in linking religious soft power to the building of military bases and management of port facilities in the Horn of Africa, as well as the hiring of private military and intelligence operatives to do the UAE's building. This is the integration of religion and politics and is clearly part of the UAE's effort at consolidating the autocratic state, said Islamic studies scholar Usama al-Azami. The Saudi effort highlights bin Zayed's success in persuading Saudi leaders to designate the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization, even if the Gulf states have had only limited success in persuading Western nations to follow suit. The Gulf states' handwriting is visible in French President Emmanuel Macron and Austrian Chancellor Sebastian Kurz's crackdowns on the Brotherhood and political Islam. To bolster his version of Islam and counter influential Qadari-backed groups associated with the Brotherhood and Turkey's outreach, bin Zayed created organizations of his own, and in 2017 helped engineer the debilitating UAE, Saudi, Bahraini, Egyptian diplomatic and economic boycott of Qatar. He flexed his financial muscle in 2012 to help orchestrate a military coup that toppled Mohammed Morsi, a Muslim brother who won Egypt's first and only free and fair election. Bin Zayed signaled his intentions a year later during a visit to Al-Azhar's sprawling 1,000-year-old mosque and university complex in Cairo, in which he committed to enabling the institution to adopt more moderate language and counter extremism and fanaticism. The UAE's hidden hand was evident in who participated in the Grozny conference. Participants included the Imam of the Al-Azhar Grand Mosque, Sheikh Ahmed Al-Tayyib, the participation of Al-Tayyib, a political appointee and salaried Egyptian government official, and other Egyptian religious luminaries who had supported Abdel Fattah al-Sisi's military coup, said much about the UAE's inroads into Al-Azhar. The Grozny conference was co-organized by the Tabakh Foundation, the sponsor of the Muslim Council of Elders, a UAE-based group founded in 2014 that aims to dominate Islamic discourse that many non-Salafis assert had been hijacked by Saudi largesse. The council, like the Forum for Promoting Peace in Muslim Societies, was created to counter the Doha-based International Union of Muslim Scholars headed by Yusuf Qaradawi, one of the world's most prominent and controversial Muslim theologians, who is widely viewed as a spiritual leader of the Muslim Brotherhood. The foundation is headed by Saudi-based Mauritanian politician and Islamic scholar Abdallah bin Baya, as well as Al-Tayyib. Bin Baya was, until he established the Emirati-supported group, vice president of Qaradawi's European Council for Fatwa and Research, established to provide guidance to European Muslims through the dissemination of religious opinions. He also heads the Emirates Fatwa Council that oversees the issuing of religious opinions and trains and licenses clerics. Bin Baya, as well as other prominent traditionalists with past ties to the Brotherhood and/or political Islam, found common ideological ground in the assertion that the Brotherhood and jihadist ideology are offshoots of ultra-conservative strands of Islam. They saw the UAE's position as rooted in decades of animosity between Al-Azhar and the Brotherhood that Egyptian presidents Jamal Abdel Nasser, Anwar Sadat, and Hosni Mubarak exploited to counter the brothers and Wahhabism. Embracing Machiavelli's notion of religion as a powerful tool in the hands of a prince, members of the Abu Dhabi ruling family, including bin Zayed and his foreign minister, began courting bin Baya in early 2013. They invited the cleric to the Emirates the same month that Morsi, the post-2011 democratically elected Egyptian president, was toppled. The courting of bin Baya emanated from bin Zayed's realization that he needed religious soft power to justify the UAE's wielding of hard power that started with the Egyptian coup and would lead to military interventions in Yemen and Libya. The emergence in recent years of bin Baya, a celebrated Islamist jurist, whom Al-Azhami, the Islam scholar, dubs counter-revolutionary Islam's most important scholar, as the religious face of the UAE, coincided, moreover, with the withdrawal from public life, more or less because of age, of the 90-year-old, far more prolific and media-savvy Qaradawi. In his comparative analysis of the thinking of bin Baya and Qaradawi, Al-Azhami suggests that it is Emirati financial and political clout, rather than intellectual output, that will determine the degree to which the UAE acquires religious soft power. There is less of a unity of purpose when it comes to Indonesia, as compared to Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Turkey, Iran, or Morocco. The Jokowi government and Nahdlatul Ulama, the world's largest Muslim movement, despite incestuous bonds, operate on parallel and at times opposite tracks. Several things differentiate Nahdlatul Ulama from the other players in the global rivalry for religious Muslim soft power. For one, Nahdlatul Ulama is a non-governmental mass movement. The Indonesian state takes a back seat in the global competition. Yet it benefits from Nahdlatul Ulama's ability to compete at the highest levels of government in world capitals, including access to the White House, the State Department, Whitehall, the European Union, various European heads of government, and Narendra Modi's BJP. Nahdlatul Ulama has been able to leverage that access to help the Jokowi government tackle problems, including trade issues with the European Union. All of this has not stopped the government from cutting its own religion-related deals with Nahdlatul Ulama's main global opponents, the UAE and Saudi Arabia. The degree to which Nahdlatul Ulama is perceived as a threat by the UAE and Saudi Arabia is evident in battles in high-level meetings, and the visit to Nahdlatul Ulama headquarters in Jakarta, the first ever by Muhammad al-Issa, the head of the Muslim World League. The League was for decades a major vehicle for Saudi global funding of religious ultra-conservatism and has become, under Mohammed bin Salman, the face of Saudi Arabia's projection of the kingdom as a proponent of a tolerant Islam that favors interfaith and interreligious dialogue and outreach to other faiths. Similarly, investment by the UAE that has so far focused globally on high-end real estate in popular housing in Nahdlatul Ulama strongholds in Java was viewed by the movement as an attempt to garner inroads into its popular base. The irony in the Jokowi government's religious dealings with the UAE is the fact that Indonesia's vice president is a Nahdlatul Ulama leader. Nahdlatul Ulama's political party has 5 ministers in Jokowi's cabinet, including the religious affairs minister. And the movement's likely next leader was a member of the president's advisory council with the rank of minister until last year. He was also Jokowi's key advisor on religious affairs. Nonetheless, Jokowi agreed in January of last year with the UAE Crown Prince to share expertise in the training of imams and Quran memorization, as well as the translation and publication of religious texts. The two countries also agreed to share delegates to Islamic fora and cooperate in mosque construction. The agreement was remarkable, not because it was government to government, without involvement of Nahdlatul Ulama, as well as Muhammadiyah, Indonesia's second largest mass movement, but because Indonesia and the UAE propagate starkly different strands of Islam. While both advocate religious tolerance and moderation and oppose political Islam, the UAE has pushed interpretation that calls for absolute obedience to the ruler, and like in Libya, support for Madkhalism, a Saudi strand of quietist, apolitical Salafism that recognizes a political leader's absolute power. In contrast, Nahdlatul Ulama preaches not only tolerance, but also pluralism, democracy, and human rights. Similarly, unlike the UAE, Nahdlatul Ulama favors faith-based engagement in politics. However, what in my mind really sets Nahdlatul Ulama apart from the UAE, and without exception, all of its religious competitors, is the fact that it has begun to reconceptualize Islam, rather than just build a facade that projects moderation and tolerance. In other words, it is seeking to create a jurisprudence with fatwas and rulings that do away with concepts such as kafir or infidels, slavery, and the notion of the dhimmi, or the people of the book, that sets Jews and Christians in a lesser category than Muslims and apart from other faith communities. Of all the major players, Nahdlatul Ulama is the only one that is seeking to match its words with deeds. Having said that, Nahdlatul Ulama has a long way to go. It remains a deeply conservative movement. Its madrasas or pesantren, particularly those associated with Bansar, the movement's 5 million strong militia, operate like militarized units. An anti-Shiite and anti-Ahmadi sentiment is ingrained in the group's DNA. By the same token, Banser is employed, to be fair, to protect Christian churches, and at times has come to the defense of Ahmadis under attack. UAE and Saudi attempts to co-opt, corral, or undermine Nahdlatul Ulama testify to the group's effectiveness on the international stage. It also reflects the fact that the appointment of Amin Ma'ruf as vice president was but a first step in Nahdlatul Ulama's quest for power. Many have said that Jokowi appointed Ma'ruf because his age would prevent him from running for president in 2024. That may well be true for Jokowi. It's certainly true for powerful elements within Nahdlatul Ulama that are grooming their own candidate. It would not be the first time that Nahdlatul Ulama gains for the top office in the land. The thinking of the late Nahdlatul Ulama leader and Indonesian president, Abdurrahman Wahid, has shaped the thinking behind Nahdlatul Ulama's emergence as a major player in the quest for religious soft power, as well as its renewed presidential ambitions. Nahdlatul Ulama's ability to compete, whether as a movement or if and when it heads a government, is evident in the increasingly influential role that it plays in organizations such as Centrist Democratic International, or CDI, the world's largest alliance of political parties that grew out of an alliance of European and Latin American Christian Democrats, and today groups ruling parties across the globe. CDI's executive includes one of Angela Merkel's closest aides, Central European government leaders, including President Janša of Slovenia and Viktor Orban of Hungary, as well as some of Europe and Latin America's most prominent politicians and former leaders. Nahdlatul Ulama's sway was evident in a resolution that was adopted at a meeting in January of last year of its executive committee in Yogyakarta that was wholly Nahdlatul Ulama thinking and language. The resolution calls for the rule of law, adherence to a universal ethics and humanitarian values based on Western humanism, Christian democracy, and Nahdlatul Ulama's concept of humanitarian Islam. The resolution urges CDI to push for a world based on those principles to counter the emergence of authoritarian, civilizationalist states that do not accept the rules-based post-World War II order, whether in terms of human rights, rule of law, democracy, or respect for international borders and the sovereignty of other nations. Some of you may have questions about the resolution. One is likely to be, how can a group that has Viktor Orban and the like-minded Slovenian president on its board be expected to adhere to the group's resolution? It's a question that I have raised and I certainly don't have an answer to. Thank you, and I look forward to a discussion.